Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're going to get into this year's edition of It's Getting Real and Hitting the Fan, talking about some real-world attacks we've seen. How many people here were at my talk last year? Okay, so not a lot. Something new. So this year, we're going to talk more about SaaS. Last year was more about cloud, and what we see is that attacks are moving to the SaaS, and we'll talk about it. So, quick introduction. For those of you who don't know me, I've been doing cybersecurity pretty much all my life, over 25 years now. Most of my career in AppSec, moved to CloudSec in the last few years. I always say I'm a CloudSec and AppSec guy a day and an incident responder at night, and that's because incidents always break up at night or at the weekend or the holiday or when you're on a family vacation and it's the most uncomfortable time, but that's just the life. So, in the last 3.5 years, I've started my last company called Mitiga. It's not a product pitch, don't worry. But what we do is we do cloud and SaaS IR. And because of that, we're exposed to a lot of incidents that happen with our customers. Customers just come to us when they're breached. And this is what this talk is all about. Share with you some of the stories, some of the interesting stories and the trends that we see around cloud attacks and SaaS attacks and how you can learn from this to be more resilient. So I think this is kind of obvious, right? Breaches are inevitable. We know that. No matter how much security we're going to put in, eventually somebody's going to get in. A misconfiguration, a mistake, a bug, a vulnerability. But the most interesting thing is everybody's talking about cloud transformation and moving to the cloud. But for a lot of companies, this actually means moving to SaaS, right? We're moving our apps to the cloud, but we're moving our corporate IT to the SaaS. Your email is now Office 365 or Google Works. Your ERP's going SAP Cloud or Oracle Cloud or NetSuite or whatever. And so this is easier for attackers to target because just like with corporate IT, it's more standard and it's where a lot of the crown jewels are. And so SaaS breaches are here. And this is what we see. More than half of the incidents we dealt with last year were predominantly SaaS, or at least included a substantial SaaS part to them. And also a big part is identity providers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So today's talk, learn about SaaS breaches through real-world stories, realize how having the right breach response can help you reduce the impact, which is what we all care about, and understand what you all can do today to become more resilient. So before I dive into the stories, I want to bring a few interesting statistics. So if you don't know the IBM Cost of Data Breach Report, they publish it every year for a lot of years now. It's a very interesting study. I strongly urge everybody to read it. But this year, they finally added cloud, and that's cloud in the comprehensive way, so including SaaS, to their statistics. And we find a few interesting things in the data there. So the first thing we discover is that this is a continuous trend, but the average cost of a data breach keeps going up. So it doesn't mean there are more data breach or less. We'll talk about that later. But these are just the data breaches that they dealt with. So while we're investing a lot in security, the impact is becoming bigger and bigger despite that. Why? Because we're not investing enough in reducing the impact. And we are moving more and more things to the cloud, right? And things to systems that are easily compromised. The other really, really interesting thing is that, again, we see that, but IBM, which is agnostic to cloud, they do IRs across all environments and all customers, they see that 45% of the breaches in 2022 was in the cloud. In 2019, it was about 20%, not from IBM, they didn't publish that, but from what we gave from other statistics. I expect 2023 to be the year where cloud breaks the 50% attacks. And cloud attacks are generally easier and more valuable for attackers. One of the most interesting things, and I'll get to that at the end of the talk, but just to put it there, that attacks on public cloud, on average, have a higher impact on organizations versus on-prem or hybrid cloud. And the reason for that has to do with how organizations deal with incidents in the cloud rather than anything else, and we'll get to that at the end. Lastly, I often hear that from people, well, we had a big breach last year, and then we really improved our posture and did a lot of things, so now we are better. 83% of organizations who had a major breach last year reported it wasn't their first one. The other 17% just don't know about the previous ones. So I want to talk about identity theft. So, me, like everybody in the industry, we've been preaching for years, you should move to single sign-on, MFA, a modern identity provider, like Azure AD or Okta or whatever. And yes, it's good, but at the same time, it's becoming the new target. And we know that whenever we build something new, the attackers find a new way to circumvent that. So I say for the last, I think 6 to 9 months, I've been evangelizing that MFA, or rather 2FA, which is what we all use, and when we say MFA, is dead in the sense that it's useless at this point. Most of the attacks we've seen, more than 50% of the attacks we've seen, start with identity theft that circumvents MFA. And we'll talk about how it's happening. So this is also some statistics. IBM, the IBM report talks about more than 33%. I guess that's because a lot of the incidents they do is also on-prem. We see phishing is more than 54% initial access vector for breaches in the cloud. That's from Dark Reading. That's also what we see. So the first way for people to circumvent MFA, if you're not familiar with it, is called MFA push fatigue. So I stole your username and password through a normal phishing. Now I try to log in, and you get an MFA push. You say, no, I don't know what that is. Who used that? You do that again and again and again, and finally you get tired. I know it sounds stupid, but that's the reality. Some people, when they ask them later, they say, oh, I thought it was maybe a service that's trying to use my credentials, or some automated system, or my phone was trying to log in. Eventually they say yes. Not always, but a lot of times. And this is very popular. Microsoft is disabling MFA push next month because of that. So that's going to be better, although it's not going to solve the second technique. The second technique we see is called adversary in the middle. And this will circumvent any type of standard MFA, if it's push or OTP or whatever you use, SMS token. And the way this works is basically real-time phishing. So instead of collecting through phishing your username and password and then using them in a later state, the adversary in the middle is a framework that in real time takes whatever username and password you sent and sends them with a new session to the real application, Microsoft, Okta, whatever. And then they bring you back the response screen, which asks for your MFA, and you give it to them, and they use it again with the real identity provider. Now they get a valid session, and they send you a little error screen, which you think, oh, it's a mistake, I'll do it later, right? And they now have a valid session. The default valid sessions on most of these identity providers is 90 days. So now the attacker can do a lot of things, and we'll talk more about things they can do that they shouldn't be able to do, but that's the world we live in. So that brings me to our first incident. So this happened a few months ago. We actually published a bunch of things on this around we discovered a big campaign doing this phishing. Basically, business email compromise. So I assume everybody's familiar with that, but business email compromise is a way to send a fake email that tells you, a fraudulent email that tells you to wire money to the wrong place, essentially, right? They're different things. But to do a business email compromise good, you need insider data. When you have insider data, it's a much better fraud than when you just try to pretend something. And so this team basically built a campaign where they would do phishing with adversary in the middle, we'll talk about it in a minute, and use that to gain access to companies and then identify good transactions to do business email compromise. So how did we get it? We got the customer telling us our CFO got a really, really weird email from the lawyer of a vendor we work with telling them that they're going through this audit and they should, and because of the audit, their bank account has changed, and here's the details for the new bank account. And they even added there, which was really cool, a really nice touch. Oh, and don't worry, we know you have procedure for phone verification of new email accounts, so don't worry, we already did the call and verified that for you, because that's the lawyer, right? And so luckily, good, aware people didn't fall for that, immediately called security and was like, this looks suspicious. But the thing is, and I know it's a little busy, but the thing is, there was an email thread between 6 people, right? There's the buyer and the vendor, and each side had a bunch of people on that and the lawyers. And the email that has this, oh, we need to change the bank account, it's a reply to on the last email in the thread. So it has all the details of everybody, all the right people on it. The only thing when we started investigating was we discovered that the actual lawyer email there was a fake domain. They created a fake domain for the lawyer. But everything else seems legit, right? So reply to it has the entire thread in it. Who would suspect that this is hacked? And it wasn't the lawyer who was hacked. They used the data from the actual account that was hacked, but just to get that data. So business email compromise is really more efficient when you have data. So we started investigating. How did they happen? We looked at we didn't know at first who was breached, right? So we looked at the lawyers, we looked at our customer. Eventually, it was the vendor that was breached. And the initial access was a really amazing phishing, probably the best phishing I've seen all my life. It was a DocuSign email, and if you work with legal, you sign so many DocuSigns every day. You just get them, you click. And it's single sign-on, so it gets you to your single sign-on sometimes. But what they did is they included, I'll show you the screenshot in a minute. It was really well crafted, so it was very hard, even for people that went through 500 phishing awareness training, to notice that, right? And then they used adversary in the middle MFA circumvention with an IP address in Singapore. So we see a login from Singapore at that time that the user gave that. And then that session that went to Singapore gets transferred to another location, another IP in Dubai. Now this is great. You have a valid working session that they created. Now it's coming from another IP. That's fine. Nobody suspects that. Why? Because people move and IPs move. So vendors can't just block you because of IP. So no re-challenge, no asking for MFA again, nothing. So they used it, and then for 9 days, this team in Dubai, I don't know if they're in Dubai, this team that comes from a Dubai IP is doing reconnaissance. So they're browsing through Office 365, Outlook, SharePoint, and looking for a transaction. So for 9 days, that's what they're doing, just looking for a transaction. And then they find the transaction. So now they have a separate team that does the business email compromise. So I'm guessing, and again, a lot of guessing here, I don't have the people's names, but I'm guessing the team that works in Dubai, APAC, doesn't have English as a native language. And to do a good business email compromise, you want to write, this is before ChatGPT. Now with ChatGPT, everybody can write a good business email compromise email. But that was, a couple of months before that was launched. So they want to hand it over to a team in the US. And we see later IPs coming from California doing the actual emailing and registration of fake domains. So what they did is they created MFA persistency. And what do I mean by that? That they will be able, going forward, to deal with MFA requests even without the user being part of the equation, right? Because this was adversary in the middle, so it's a one-time thing. And they used a weakness in Microsoft. Siri decided to speak. They used a weakness in Microsoft that allows you to add another authenticator app without requiring MFA again. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, they executed the attack, right? So they registered fake domains for the emails. They registered fake domain for the email that's being sent, but also for all the other parties that was not the CFO getting it, because they didn't want anybody else to notice something weird. And then they did the reply to, send the mail, and again, that's where we were called and stopped them. So I want you to show you a few things here. So first thing, this is the DocuSign email. It looks like every DocuSign email I ever got in my life. Perfect. Not only it's perfect, it's too small to see here, but the from is dsc@docusign.net. It's not a fake domain. It's not anything. Now, you ask yourself, and that's what I asked myself when we started investigating, how do you circumvent DMARC in today's world, right? Every normal organization will not allow spoofed emails to come in. Oh, so there's a great answer. When you onboard DocuSign, their support suggests that you add dsc@docusign.net to your whitelist because it sometimes gets blocked by spam. Now, once it's on whitelist, it passes DMARC tests as well. Why? I'm not sure. There's no granularity in the whitelist to say not spam, but still do DMARC. So, I don't know if everybody, a lot of organizations, I later checked, a lot of our customers have dsc@docusign on their whitelist. We actually had it too. I removed it after that. And then it was very targeted. So it was only sent to the CFO and CEO. So not to a lot of people in the company because that triggers discovery. Pretty good work, got the phishing email. This person, the person did the login. Again, it's a little hard to read, but basically we see the Singapore login. And then the next thing we see, and this is great, this is them adding the second MFA. So they added a new phone, Marty's iPhone, was added as a second MFA device for this account. And that, again, got me really, really puzzled because just as an inherent feeling, it's like when you add an authenticator, you expect it to ask you for your MFA challenge before you change something in your MFA settings, right? But not in Microsoft. So Microsoft has conditional access, which is basically what checks your MFA. And it has things, services, apps that are using conditional access, right? And so they go to conditional access and they say, can you check if this user is MFA? And then conditional access is supposed to do that. But the way it works, right, so we see here the user going to the security portal. That's where you need to add MFA. So it says conditional access success, multi-factor authentication. Okay, so it did check for it, but it didn't really. So if you look at the details, MFA requirement satisfied by claim and token. And what this means is that if you already did MFA with this account in the time frame that is your default token, which is 90, then every new check for MFA will just say, oh, it's already satisfied. So you go to the security portal, right? We already have the session that's valid. Remember, it was July 20th. This is now July 30. 10 days later, they create an MFA. No problem. You're satisfied. And we're adding the authenticator. And so they created that. Again, the whole story, did the emails. Luckily for our customer, they weren't breached because they were aware. But we then discovered it was part of a huge campaign. We don't know exactly how many affected, but discovered over 4,000 attempts at different organizations going with that. So this. Okay, incident number 2, multi-SaaS ransomware. So this started for a customer like this. They got a call from the FBI. We got an anonymous tip that you've been spear-phished and you're compromised. That's it, no data, nothing. They start investigating, and with their own SOC team, they look at things, they find out that they're not called FUBAR, obviously, but their domain name, somebody created okta-theirdomainname.com and their domain name .okta.com. And that assumed was a phishing site. They didn't see the phishing emails, but that was assumed as a phishing site. And then they started looking at Okta logs, and they found that there was an Okta account that was breached of one of their CSRs. So they block it. Sounds reasonable enough, right? And then about a day later, they get this, the CISO get this message on Slack. So the attackers got through Okta and single sign-on, and then they used it to log into various apps. We'll talk about in a minute. One of them was Slack. Once you log into Slack, you get a Slack session token that no longer cares about your original SSO session token. So they're still logged into Slack even though their SSO was blocked. And so the message says, nope, you didn't stop anything, because they saw they got blocked. And then that's a whole ransom demand. They claim they have 585 gigabytes of data, and they spend time on Slack. They know who the CISO is. This comes to the CISO's personal Slack account, while, of course, he's on a vacation, because it's a holiday, because that's when incidents occur. And basically, threatening, publishing the data, contacting their customers, contacting their family members, all kinds of bogus threats. And then what I really like, that's a nice new touch. The OFAC has now said that you can't pay ransomware to terrorist organizations or any organizations that are suspected as being terrorists. So they're telling you, don't worry, we are not an entity which is sanctioned by the OFAC. You can pay us the ransomware. Great. Of course, from a liability perspective, I guess that works. They said they're not. So then we get a call, right? And the customer calls and say, okay, we have a major incident. We have ransomware. We've been breached. And then there are always 3 questions that people ask when there's a breach, right? How did they get in? What data they have? And what is still compromised? And so what data they have is the most important thing for understanding the impact, notification, ransom, all that stuff. How did they get in is important to understand how to lock them out and prevent it. And what is still compromised is for eradication, right? We want to make sure that we don't leave anything there. So we started investigating. We first went through this. So MFA fatigue, twice. This was great. So we see in the logs MFA fatigue, 6 total attempts, then 5 total attempts. You see the 2 IPs there. And why is it twice? Because Okta, unlike Microsoft, does require MFA to registering a new device. And they wanted to register a new device. So they did MFA push fatigue once to log in, and then a second time to register a new device. And the CSR fell for it twice. And again, I don't blame them. That's normal. But first attempt was 6, then second one was 5, right? And then we see 55 different accesses to Okta. And that's basically somebody browsing through their single sign-on app directory. So single sign-on is a great security measure, but it also means that once your identity is compromised, everything is compromised, right? You've heard the term identities is the new perimeter. It is. And so you go to this portal, you don't even have to guess. You just go to the portal and get all these apps and you click them one by one. And so that's what happened. Oh, wait, I forgot this. They also put in a rule that sends all sign-in emails. You get an email and you sign in to the trash, so the user won't see that somebody's signing in on their device. So Okta single sign-on, they accessed over 15 apps. I don't show all of them because if you correlate all 15 of them, you might understand who the customers. But here are some of the main ones. And basically, they asked us, they're claiming they have 585 gigabytes of data. They clearly accessed a lot of stuff. They gave a few screenshots of stuff they brought from Zendesk, which is their support system. That's where the CSR had most permissions, obviously. And they demanded a big ransomware. So what do we do now? So we had to identify all these SSO applications that was accessed. For each one, see what was accessible to that user, if it's at all relevant data, and then see what they took from it. And that's a big exercise to do, but a super important one. And then eventually to create a full timeline and data exfiltration map. And we're able to prove that only 20 gigabytes were stolen, not 585 as they claimed. And so, they started with Okta, they breached the portal. We knew they breached Zendesk. So the 20 gig were mostly Zendesk. They had the CSR had permission pretty much to everything. They exported everything on Zendesk. So a lot of customer PII, but not super sensitive. So, emails, names, but there are no credit cards, nothing sensitive from a privacy perspective. So, half a problem. They compromised Google Workspace, but they honestly didn't get a lot of stuff there because the CSR didn't have a lot of stuff there. They compromised Slack. We know that because they sent the message through Slack. They didn't touch Zoom. Probably nothing interesting there. They logged into Workday, but they didn't take anything. So we don't know. But again, maybe it's just that user-limited view, so not so much to see. This was the most interesting. They logged into 1Password, which was also single sign-on, and they got a bunch of passwords that this user had access to, but none of them were used. Of course, we rotated everything with the customer, but not so clear. But I guess they were just like any other attack. They were campaigning. So, quick, found something, download, screenshots, ransomware, moving on to the next target. And they didn't touch Atlassian, touched a few other systems. But eventually, and so, we were working with the customer. They had a negotiator. They demanded $3 million in ransom. But having the knowledge of what they actually took, which was a lot less than what they claimed, and the potential impact and liability allowed them to get it down to $250. Because when you have, when when the other side's bluffing, you can negotiate. And the attacker knew they were bluffing. And so it was fine to pay $250 to keep this quiet from the media, but not $3 million because the data wasn't that sensitive. Okay, next story. This is happening all the time. So GitHub. Everybody's now on GitHub. GitHub has this thing where it makes all your employees use their private username when they use GitHub. You can link it also to your corporate identity, but there's all this confusion there, and so that leads to mistake. So in here, a developer accidentally merges the code he's working on to his personal repo, which is, of course, public. Now, I don't know if you know that, but there are, thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know the amount, but infinite amount of scanners that continuously scan all public repo on GitHub for secrets all the time. If you put a secret in GitHub, it's compromised within seconds, okay? That's very simple. So, of course, it got compromised. And so 2 AWS keys were exposed. The threat actor used one of them to access AWS and started reconnaissance. Luckily, the developer noticed that quickly, so they didn't get a lot of stuff done. But they called us and say, okay, how do we know what happened, right? So we got the keys, now how do we know what happened? And that kind of puts you in more of a threat hunting mode than an IR, because, okay, we've seen that was a compromise, that was the access. And what we basically saw is most of what the attacker had time to do was something called get caller identity. It's basically a way to enumerate your access and permissions on AWS. So they were starting the work. They didn't do a lot other than that. And so no big impact for the customer, but could have been. And we've seen other cases where this has been a lot worse. So look at these, compare IPs against known usage, figure out what's going on. But I want to take this example to go into what's going on right now with the CI/CD in general, right? So GitHub, GitLab, there was a CircleCI breach a few months ago. Probably heard about it. CircleCI is probably the most popular CI/CD system, and it allows you to push your code into production continuously. Very cool. We use it too. It was breached. And the thing is, CircleCI holds a lot of secrets because it needs these secrets to connect to all these different systems. It's just a snapshot. And basically, if you look, it's hard to read, but immediately rotate any and all secrets stored in CircleCI. So their understanding of their breach was that their secrets, or your secrets, on their platform were compromised. So big panic for a lot of companies, us included. We spent a long time making sure nobody used any of our secrets there. So we published this. If you're interested, you can look later on our website. But it's basically sort of a small threat hunting guide on how to look for things. And one of the challenges that we see for organizations with all these different SaaS platforms is that each of them has a different set of logs and logic for the logs. And so it's hard for people to really be able, in a short time, to start investigating a platform that they've never before seen or understand, right? The SOC analyst is not necessarily a developer, doesn't know CI/CD, doesn't understand these logs. So this is happening all the time. Okay, last story, and that goes back to cloud rather than SaaS, but just because it's a breach that came to us just while I was building this presentation, so I really wanted to put it in, right? So this was really interesting. So one of the things that we do for our customers threat hunting. And so we onboarded a new customer, we started running our threat hunting, and we suddenly see this pattern that they have every day of an AWS account with a specific access key that turns AMIs that they create as part of their product into public, and then immediately after that, somebody comes from a Tor exit node and downloads them, right? And we look back, and this is going back as far as we can see. So default logs for AWS, 90 days. So if you don't do anything to pull them and keep them, you have only 90 days. So we see 90 days back. This, we started investigating. And basically we see that we cannot investigate the initial access vector because we only have 90 days of logs, and it seems like the last time this key was rotated was over 2 years ago. So, we don't know, but clearly it's compromised. And then we did containment and eradication, right? So rotation of the key, removal of all the public AMIs created by them, and then started investigating together with the customer, of course, because they know their data, what's in those AMIs. Luckily, internal data, but not hysterically confidential. And no ransom demand came. So we blocked this, nothing came. So, let's wait. It's been a month now since that, something like that. Let's wait to see if something comes back. But I think they've been fine. But it just shows you there's so much stuff going on right now in cloud and SaaS. And we spoke with them and say, we have a SIEM, SOC, alerts, detection, guard duty, everything. And this just, came through that because the problem with security monitoring, security detection, it looks for very clear malicious patterns. But this is not a malicious pattern. This is legitimate activity by a user. Of course, it's not legitimate, but because they haven't seen the original compromise, they can't know that this is happening. Okay, so hopefully I scared you enough. So how do we prepare for SaaS incidents and cloud ones? So we said breaches are inevitable. The world is moving to SaaS. We need to do 3 things. We need to collect data, forensics data, because unlike traditional on-prem, we don't have access to SaaS and cloud systems the way we want to. We can't duplicate their disks. We can't run things on their hardware. So we are in the hands of the provider, and the providers usually give you up to 90 days, sometimes 30 days, sometimes 7 days of logs. So collect data, prepare, and then work to reduce your time to recover. And I want to go back, 1 second. So these are the things you want to think of collecting. So your identity provider is the #1 thing where you want to collect the logs, stream them to your SIEM, look at alerts for them, and so on. Why? Because that's where more than 50% of the attacks start. Of course, you want your cloud, right? Your AWS, Azure, and so on. And these are multiple data sources in each of them, right? Azure especially, just trying to figure out one event in Azure, you need to correlate 4 different log sources and so on. It's a fun work. Productivity suites, because that's your new corporate infrastructure, right? That is your corporate infrastructure. And then SaaS apps. And that's infinite. So you need to map which are the critical ones for you. But Salesforce, for sure. Workday, for sure. It was just somebody told me about an incident they saw in Workday where somebody broke in, changed the account numbers for employees so the salaries go to the wrong account. Great. The other thing you really want to do is have an IR plan and an IR team, in-house or outside. And this is really interesting statistics. I'm going back to IBM for a second. One of the things I did this year was say, look at what are the biggest influences on impact, right, on the cost of data breach. This does not talk about detection. Maybe having different technologies reduces the likelihood of a breach. But if you already have a breach, what is the single thing that reduces the cost of it the most? And the answer is being ready for an IR. So if you have an IR plan and an IR team, if you look, that's the third bar, that's about 3 million in impact versus almost 6 million average impact for those that don't have IR plan and don't have IR team. And just for comparison, having XDR only reduces it from 455 to 415. And don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean XDR is worthless. XDR helps prevent and detect them earlier, so it reduces likelihood. But once you're already breached, you really want this IR plan and team. And if you don't do preparations for incidents, you should. The second thing that influences your time to recover is, your impact is time to recover. And so that's tied to that. If you have the right plans and teams, you'll reduce time to recover. It's almost a linear relation. The longer it takes to contain a breach, the bigger its impact. So always think about time to recover. And what we see, and this was really interesting and surprising, that this number is 200 days to detect and 70 days to contain. It's pretty much around that average for years now. But in the cloud, what we see is these numbers are higher for most organizations. Only the really, really advanced ones are actually lower. But people who have a medium or lower maturity in cloud security have longer time to detect and contain incidents. And that's why, if you remember in the beginning, I said public cloud breaches cost more. Not because the cloud is not as good, just because organizations are not as ready to deal with cloud breaches. So, how do we apply all of what we learned today tomorrow when we come back from this beautiful city? First thing, go and understand where you stand on SaaS exposure. And this is probably where most organizations are the most behind in, right? Cloud, everybody's starting to do some proper cloud security. SaaS is very, very early on. Identify what are your critical SaaS apps. So again, your identity provider, for sure, your productivity suite, but then, again, Salesforce, ERP, whatever you have that is critical SaaS. Assess the scope of your productivity suite and try to understand how broad is your identity provider and single sign-on. If it encompasses everything, it gives you a lot of visibility and security, but also means you have a single point of failure. Next month, start to build your forensics data readiness. Because as I said, I was just sitting in a conversation with a CISO of a large ERP company and said, our default logs are 7 days. Every week somebody calls me and say, we had a breach. How can we tell what happened? If it's more than 7 days, you can't. If you want it, we give you an API. You have to take it and store it, but nobody does. And so build your forensics data readiness, identify what's available, start collecting it to your SIEM. Not all SIEMs do really well with SaaS data, so maybe create a new data lake for that, and map what's missing. A lot of SaaS vendors will only let you collect data if you're in the high tier of the enterprise grade, right? We talk about it in Slack. We see that other places. And then finally, start building that. Build tools, build playbooks, prepare for SaaS incidents. See that you have people on your team or that you can work with that understand those different SaaS logs, that they can research them when something happens, because having the data alone is not enough. So, thank you. If you have questions, there are mics here and there, so I'm happy to take questions.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Really, really cool talk. Thank you. And When you're looking, you mentioned how important the identity provider is, right?
Yes.
Clearly, that's a big deal. When you've been working with these things and the SSO sort of gets you into everything, are there things people should be doing in terms of limiting privileges for individual accounts or individual users? And do you ever see people doing that, or is it sort of one account gets you everything?
Well, there are permissions, and of course you manage them per SaaS app, and you can also limit which user can access which SaaS app. So we do see permission management, of course. Some do it better than others, and it's important to do so. But really, the problem is still, within the permissions that you have, you can access everything. Yeah.
Hi. Kind of flipping the script, sorry if I'm abusing, but because we develop a SaaS service. So, and we see customers that ask us to receive logs in their SIM, whatever
Yes.
that means, which will make no sense for them. And they normally log in through single sign-on, so allegedly they should have their log. So my question would be, how can I actually help? Let's say that I want to help, because normally our application isn't breached. What happens is that their accounts are breached, and someone accesses their account through their breached account.
Yes, so as I said, during a forensic investigation, when we do IR, we want to know not only if it was breached, but what did the user do? So if you're a SaaS provider and you want to help your customers, you need to build a log that is as detailed as possible on actions that users do. Oh, this user accessed this data. This user deleted this data. This user created a new account, changed a permission. All these things you should log, and you should expose this log to your customers via API. Then they can stream it to their SIM. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to create alerts on it, although they might. But it means that at least when there's an incident, they are able to investigate and understand what happened. Otherwise, it's a black box. Okay, somebody got in. We don't know what they did.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you. I'll be here.